Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Did you know that there are 7,000 languages spoken around the world? 7,000. If we were in India alone, there are 121 officially recognized languages. In China, there are 302. Distinct, we're not talking like one or two words different, we're talking distinct languages. Now in U.S. schools, think back to your time in high school, or tough, get ready for this, you're going to have to take a foreign language. Okay? And usually in the American schools, we teach one of four, right? Or they offer four. So usually they're Spanish, German, French, and Latin. Latin is always an interesting one to me. It's a dead language, but it's the root of so many others. So my wife took Latin in high school. That's why she understands that kind of stuff a lot better than I do. I took Spanish. And so the question becomes, so why do we do that? Well, it turns out that if you take a foreign language, it's very beneficial, or muy beneficioso, or très bénéfique for you to take a foreign language, because it does a lot of things, but the top ones are these. First of all, it improves your memory. Second, it makes people better at multitasking. They've done these studies that people who know a second language, their brain fires up on different cylinders, and they can do things, multiple tasks at the same time. It expands your vocabulary, and perhaps the most important thing of all is if you go to a foreign country, you can ask, where is the bathroom? It's important to know. Now, many of us have had exposure to different languages. When I was at KU for my degree is in journalism and mass communication. And so for that, we had to have 4 semesters, which was the most, unless you were a foreign language major, that was the most you had to take at the entire University of Kansas. So by the time I got done with the 4 semesters, I could read it, write it, and I could speak it a little bit better than I could before. Now, when I got out of school, how did I use that? Well, luckily, when I was in Springfield, Missouri, I was on a team of editors that we put together a weekly section of Spanish news. And then when I was in Utah, we actually launched a Spanish publication. Now, I did not edit this thing word for word, but I supervised the people who did, so I had to know what was in it. And to this day, I can read Spanish fairly well. I can write it a little bit. Speaking it, I'm awful. Because unless you talk all the time using the language, you don't get immersed in it. You just can't keep up. I can't keep up with the cadence of a Spanish speaker. My videographer at my day job is from Spain, and our bishop is originally from Texas, but he's from Hispanic origin. And so the two of them will get together and they'll start talking. And after about the 3rd or 4th exchange, I am lost because of the speed at which they speak. Unfortunately, language can be a really, really tricky thing, and stuff can get lost in translation. And that's important, obviously, for like foreign affairs types of things, where there's like life and death type situations that are happening. There's just some really unfortunate and honestly some hilarious challenges that come up when you talk about marketing and advertising. So I thought I would share a few of those more lighthearted ones with you this morning about how language can get twisted. The Chevy Nova. Unfortunately, in Spanish, that name Nova translates to no-go, which is a terrible name for a car, right? Some of you are familiar with the Parker pens. These are really, really nice pens. I lose way too many pens for me to be trusted with one of these pens. But its motto is, it won't leak in your pocket. But when that's translated, I think this was in France, but maybe it was Mexico, can't remember now. But anyway, it translates to, it will impregnate you. That's not good. Coors had a promotion called Turn It Loose. And the idea of this ad campaign was relax, loosen up, have some fun. Unfortunately, when it was in Spain, it got translated to suffer from diarrhea. And it's no question why the sales didn't do so well. In one dialect in China, Coca-Cola literally translates to bite the wax tadpole. So people didn't know what to do with it. They weren't sure what that meant. And then one of the more unfortunate ones, Mercedes, right? This is like a great car in the United States. But in one of the different Chinese dialects of language, it means literally rush to die. That's a tough one for a car. Now, not every translation that gets lost, not every lost translation is actually bad. Sometimes there is a good thing that happens to it. And there's no better example I can find than this one of a company that opened up a chocolate line in Japan in the 1950s. Their motto, I don't know what they were trying to get people to do, but what it translated to was to convince men to accept chocolate from women on Valentine's Day. So the idea, like here it's opposite, but women would buy chocolate for men on Valentine's Day. And apparently it was a great campaign because it worked like crazy. They broke records for chocolate sales. And the good news is the men, a month later on March 14th, started to reciprocate. And so they have done that ever since the 1950s in Japan. So it's a great thing. If you're a couple, you have two opportunities for chocolate. February 14th and March 14th, and it's continued to this day. So not every mistranslated marketing ploy is bad. Well, we are continuing today on our year-long approach through the Bible, venture through the Bible, of just some of the great stories that are in there. And what do they have to tell us today in the 21st century? And today we're going to look at Genesis 11. It's a story that's only 9 verses long. You probably know it, but it's one that if you are going through the epic stories of the Bible, this might be one you just kind of glance over because we typically just do that. It's Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9, and this is what it says. All people on the earth had one language and the same words. When they traveled east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and make them hard." They used bricks for stones and asphalt for mortar. They said, "Come, let's build for ourselves a city and tower with its top in the sky, and let's make a name for ourselves so that we won't be dispersed over all the earth." And the Lord said, "There is now one people, and they all have one language. This is what they have begun to do, and now all that they plan to do will be possible for them. Come, let's go down and mix up their language there so they won't understand each other's language." Then the Lord dispersed them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore it is named Babel, because there the Lord mixed up the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over all the earth. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of Scripture. This story is told right after the tale of Noah. And so we don't really know how much time has transpired, but it has to be a fairly significant amount of time. Because remember, there were only 8 people on the ark. And they had to populate the earth. That was their task. And now we have enough people that they are starting to gather, and they're starting to think about what they could do. And they decide they're going to build a grand city, and they're going to build a tower that reaches up to the heavens. That's what they decide they're going to do with their time. Now, they aren't up against any of the things that our normal today kinds of municipalities deal with. There's no such thing as being landlocked. There is no such thing as overcrowding. But they are at least very clear about what they want to accomplish with this. Verse 4 says it for us. "And let's make a name for ourselves so that we won't be dispersed over all the earth." They wanted to build something that was going to bring them fame. They wanted to be known for something. They were kind of prideful about it. That's what they were about. And that's often where we stop with this story. Because it's fairly basic, right? God wanted them to do something. They did something else. They decided they wanted to build something big and be more like God. God comes in, mixes up the language a little bit, casts them out, scrambles them a little bit. It's a very simple, like, not necessarily crime and punishment, but a sin and punishment story. And that would be the end of it. And honestly, if that's all we got out of it, there's nothing wrong with that story. It's important for us to recognize that when God gives us a direction, we're supposed to follow it. And If we don't, there are consequences. That's the basis of this story. But if we take a look at it a little bit differently, in the context of what God instructed Moses and his children to do, like we talked about last week, and we then look at this story, we see a whole different layer of why was God so upset about them trying to build a tower. Remember what God told Noah and his family upon leaving the ark. Remember, don't make the world like it was. It needs to be better. There's a reason I did all this. Don't mess it up again. That was the first thing he told them. And then he says, be fertile and multiply. And then remember what the third thing was that he told them? Spread out. Don't stay here. Spread out. God's intention was for them to populate the entire of creation, not just to stay in one location. Well, something goes awry, horribly awry, because apparently they didn't understand that. They just decided, well, we're just going to stay here. We're going to make this grand city. We're going to build a tower. We're going to make sure we're famous. We're going to make sure people understand we were here. They're going to know us. So God decides to give them a little push. He says, come, let's go down and mix up their language. That's what verse 7 says. In effect, so that they wouldn't be able to communicate as easily with each other, they'd have to work for it. They'd have to want to understand what the other person was saying, so they would work through whatever they had to do to understand that person. Have you ever come across someone who speaks a different language than you, and you want to communicate with them, and you just really have that struggle? We were in the Holy Land in January and early February of 2019, and we come to the Jerusalem Museum, which is this amazing museum that has, basically it's a museum of the Holocaust. And so we are there, and there's a docent in one of the rooms, and I remember just having a question about one of the statements, and I don't think I really said it to anybody other than I was just kind of talking out loud. And I said it, and this man comes over, and he starts talking to me in what I'm pretty sure was Hebrew, but I'm not positive. He understood my question, but he didn't know how to answer me in English. And so he tried to tell me as best he could. And finally he walks over, and apparently he could read it pretty well, but he could point out to me my answer was actually right there on a different panel. This man answered my question, but he had to want to help me to get me that answer. So maybe God just wanted us to understand that we needed to work a little harder to understand one another. Maybe he wanted to make sure that we just didn't stay in one location. Remember what his rule was. He said, don't make this world like it was before. Be fertile and multiply and spread out. But I think there might be even one more thing that God wanted to teach us. Because maybe God wanted to teach the people then and there about communicating better with each other and to spread out and to be obedient. But maybe that lesson was going to carry through the centuries to those of us today. Because there's one more layer to this that I think often gets lost. Think about what the people who were there in the city wanting to build the tower, what did they want to do most? They wanted to stay together. They wanted to be unified. They didn't want anybody from the outside coming in. They wanted to be homogeneous. They didn't want anybody that wasn't part of them to be there. They wanted to make a name for themselves. The people who built it were the ones that were going to be famous. Maybe God's trying to teach us that God doesn't want homogeneous behavior. God just maybe wants us to embrace diversity. That's what would have happened if they had scattered, but that's not what happened because they stayed put. And isn't that idea of diversity an important lesson for us today? In a world that is connected more than ever before. Used to be if you wanted to meet a person of color or a person that was different than you in any kind of way, shape, or form, you had to physically be with them in the same room. That's not the way it is anymore, is it? We can interact on Zoom, we can interact via email, we can interact on social media. We have so many different ways to meet people different from us today. And I think it's important that we meet people who are different from us. Folks, as you are well aware, over the last couple of years, we have seen all kinds of examples, unfortunately, of white supremacy. Now, maybe it's been there all along. Maybe it never went away. We like to think, oh, the 60s happened, and then the 70s, and then everything was harmonious. That's not the way it worked, unfortunately. But it's real. My big aha moment on this was when I was a newspaper editor in St. George, Utah. Remember what January of 2008 brought us? We had our first black president. Barack Obama won the election, and then we had the inauguration in January of 2008. And it was then that I started getting all kinds of letters, emails. Sometimes people would call me under the guise of, I really disagree with this guy's policies. This is going to be the downfall of our country. And if it had just been about policy stuff, that's what this thing called democracy is all about. Let's have that discussion. But almost every one of them, and I'm not exaggerating here, included some type of racial epithet or some type of statement that had to do with stereotypes of black people in the United States. I just thought that was sad. And originally I thought, well, you know what? Southern Utah is an interesting place. It was way overwhelmingly white. But then when I moved to Lawrence, have you looked at bumper stickers when you're at stop signs lately? Even in Lawrence, you'll see some scary stuff. You'll see some remarks about going back to the North and South. You'll see remarks about the Confederacy on bumper stickers. Cars that are driving around in our community. It's kind of scary for me. Now I recognize that some of this very well might be because of ignorance of people. And that can happen because, let's face it, we tend to group with people who are just like us. That is human nature. You actually have to work at it to get with other folks. I've learned that over the years. Folks who are not like you. I'm going to pick on my kids here. They'll watch the video, they'll get with me later. But my kids grew up, for the most part, in St. George, Utah. St. George is a community that was about 91% white when we lived there. And so that 9%, the largest group by far were Hispanic people, and then Pacific Islanders, which is because of the impact of the Mormon Church and where they do their missionary work. African Americans and Asian Americans were very, very, very small in number. Less than 3% at the time we lived there. My daughter, when she went to high school, it was a brand new high school. She was one of the people there that it opened just the year before she started high school, so she was one of the fairly newer people to be there. There was one black kid in her entire class. One. He was the quarterback on the football team. Stereotypical and everything, but great kid, but he was the only one that I know of. Now my daughter, because she was a basketball player and was pretty good at it, she was exposed to people of different cultures and different races way differently than the rest of her teammates and classmates, because she had the opportunity to play for a team that, it was at the time, I don't know if they still are or not, but they were a top 25 club team. Las Vegas Elite was their name. And so she was one of only 2 white kids on her team. So she was the opposite. But she got to know people of different races. She stayed at their houses. She traveled with them. She got to know people of color. A small number. It's not like she knew a lot, but it was at least some exposure that some of her friends had never had. Our son grew up in that environment, but we moved to Lincoln, Nebraska between his sophomore and junior years in high school. Now his class, I believe, had a whopping 4 people of color in it. Things were changing. Hey, it's a 400% increase from 3 years before. But think about this. So he gets to Lincoln, Nebraska, and instead of almost no people of color, it's still a small number, but 10% of his class was black. 18% of his class were minorities of various kinds, which seems like a small number, but when you come from a community where there are none, my wife and I felt pretty good about, okay, he's finally meeting some people, and indeed he had several friends that were not as pale as me. I thought that was a great thing. And those relationships he's kept up over the years. Now, for comparison's sake, Douglas County is 83% white as of the 2020 census. Hispanic is our largest non-majority population, 6.7%. Blacks and Asians, 4.7% each. Small numbers. So why should we care about diversity? It's because we can learn from diversity. I've got 3 examples I want to share with you quickly. And I'll confess this first one is a stretch. It's a little out there, but I love Mexican food. Anybody here not like Mexican food? Good. I didn't want to see any hands go up there. But it's not just because of the Mexican food. Since I've been in the Great Plains, we have a bishop, like I said, who's of Hispanic descent, and I travel with him a lot. And he loves to eat dinner at Mexican restaurants. And so he and I go out quite often, and what I enjoy about it is when I go with him, I'm not going to the chain. We're going to some mom and pop place in that town where it's authentic. Stuff that will set your mouth on fire. I'm not usually a fan of that, but I have to just kind of endure it because he really loves these places. But what I understand, what I like so much about it is when he gets there, we start talking with the people, whether it's the waiter or the waitress or the owner. They speak in Spanish, and so I get a little bit of a chance to practice that a little bit. But what I always enjoy about it is afterwards he will explain to me, here's what this tradition is. Here's why they do this. Here's why this is on the menu. Here's what this means in our culture. So I learn just a little bit every time we go out to eat. So I got to think, well, what about other cultures that I interact with? In the Great Plains Conference, which is all Kansas and Nebraska, we have about 960 churches. And about, I want to say about 70 of those are led by pastors who are originally from Africa. For some reason, the Great Plains feels like home to them. They've invited their friends over. They've done great work. And so they've been assigned to churches. What have I learned by interacting with people who are originally from Africa? Well, I've learned this. Spirituality is important. You will never feel more moved than if you go to a worship service that's led by an African pastor. Specifically, if that person also has African musicians. At our annual conference just a few weeks ago, we had this group of folks who are, I can't remember which country they are primarily from in Africa, but this group is at a neighbor. All these folks are from one neighborhood church in North Omaha, in the Benson neighborhood is what it's called, and they are amazing.
Welcome to next video.
Absolutely amazing.
You can talk to me anytime by saying.
So spirituality is important. Second thing I've learned is the importance of continuing education. Because disproportionately, the pastors who come from Africa have doctorates. They've continued to learn, continued to expand their knowledge. And frankly, just the willingness to adapt. These folks are from Africa. So English is obviously a second language. For some of them, it's a third or fourth. Or I have one friend who's a pastor. He speaks 5 languages fluently. He's originally from Zambia. But I've learned the importance of adapting because they are serving congregations that look just like y'all. In many cases, they're the only black family in that community. And yet they're serving God that way. So what about a little bit closer to home? This is Robert Johnson. He's a friend of mine. He's a pastor at St. Mark United Methodist Church in Wichita, the largest black church in the Midwest. It's in Wichita, Kansas. And here's what I've learned from worshiping with some of our African pastors, or African American pastors rather. First of all, don't be afraid to let yourself go and worship. It is an experience. If you go to St. Mark and you worship there are going to be people who stand up. There are going to be people who clap with the hymns. There are going to be people that shout, "Amen, hallelujah," and say it, Pastor. I don't know what I'd do if any of y'all did that here. Let's try it. It might be kind of fun. But it's a moving experience. The other thing I learned, and this is something I promise I won't pull on you, is forget about a clock. Because we're done somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour from when we start. 2 hours is not beyond the norm in the black churches that I have had the experience of worshiping in. And finally, and this is something you all would do really well at as part of one of those churches, and that's the importance of looking out for each other. Some people would call that nosy, but I'm here to tell you, those folks, when I'm in those churches, they know if somebody's suffering from an ailment, or if they're facing a tough decision, or if something's happened in their family, they know about it, and they are there to support one another. And in some cases, frankly, something we don't have to worry about. It has to do with their safety. Black man maybe got pulled over the night before. He gets up in the worship service. I've heard this a couple times. He's at prayer request time. Man stands up and he talks about interactions he's had with either police department or from a neighbor that didn't recognize who he was and had a gun pulled on him, and how scary that kind of thing was. Watching out for safety with each other is important. Now, those are just 3 examples from my life. You probably have your own. I mean, there's people in here who have been college professors, who work in schools, folks who I know have run their own businesses. You have interacted with people who are different than you. That's the nature of what happens in a society, and that's fantastic. You probably have even better examples than what I've shared. Make sure you share those with people. Make sure you share those experiences so people know what it is like to interact with someone who does not look like them. Now, most of you know I'm a sports nut. But for years and years and years, I have subscribed to exactly one magazine. It's the only one I subscribe to. It's National Geographic. Here's the reason why. Every issue, I get to learn about a group of people I didn't know about before, or some new development within a group of people that I didn't know about that happened, or a section of the world that I knew nothing about or know very little about in relation to what that might mean for me. So I subscribe because I feel smarter about the world when I read this magazine. I'm here to tell you that I'm not getting any kind of financial cut from National Geographic. They couldn't care less. But I read this magazine because I feel like I learn about people who are different from me every time that I open the cover. And I think that's an important issue for all of us. And I think that's a lesson that's hidden in this story of the Tower of Babel. Our God is a God of diversity. He wanted people to spread out. He wanted people to learn about places other than where they already were. They chose not to do that, so God had to give them a push. So I'm going to challenge you this week to go back and read that story one more time. Take your bulletin home with you. It's in there. It's Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. And I want you to think about what the people did compared to what God had told them to do. And then with that idea of diversity in mind, I want you to think individually about what's one thing you could do in the next week, month, maybe it's a year, that will expose you to somebody who doesn't look like you. So you learn about some other culture that's not yours. I think what's going to happen is, even though we're very different as people, my background's different than yours. It's different than somebody who comes to us from the African continent. It's different from somebody who grew up in Robert Johnson, the the African-American pastor that I shared. He grew up in Mississippi and tells great stories about growing up in Mississippi. His background's vastly different than mine. Folks, he's a 49ers fan. That's just wrong. That's just wrong. But he and I can still get along, despite him rooting for the San Francisco 49ers. I want you to think about how you might interact with someone who's different than you. And then maybe seek out a way to do that over the next, like I said, day, week, maybe a month, maybe even over the next year. I think what you're going to find is you're going to be enriched for it. I think you're going to find that you learn something. I think you're going to find that through all this divisiveness in our world right now, that we can build a little bit of unity through the diversity that we will experience. Amen.